watching France 24. It's 6 a.m. here in Paris. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. The White House rejects calls by US Democrats for a special prosecutor to take over the investigation into Russia's alleged ties with the Trump campaign after the US president sacks the FBI director in charge. Brazil's former president makes a fiery defense against corruption charges against him in his first appearance before a judge who's promised to clean up the country's politics. And who'll be running under Emmanuel Macron's banner? We'll be showing you some of the candidates in next month's parliamentary elections, just hours before the president's new party announces them. Also coming up in the programme, we'll be finding out why children in Togo are at risk of torture and even death from the very people they trust to protect them. That's coming up in Focus. And in sports, we'll be bringing you the very latest results in football, with Real Madrid making it to the final of the Champions League to face off with Juventus. Good to have you with us. I'm Belle Lupton, here with you for this morning's Live from Paris. And we begin in Washington, which is still reeling after Donald Trump's shock dismissal of the FBI chief yesterday. James Comey was fired shortly after he requested more resources to pursue his investigation into Russia's election meddling and the possible involvement of Trump associates. The White House has rejected calls from Democrats for a special prosecutor to take over that investigation. It says Comey's firing was motivated only by concerns over his handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, and that the move will restore trust in the Bureau. But FBI agents around the US say it'll do just the opposite. Alison Sargent has the story.
Why did you fire Director Comey?
Because he wasn't doing a good job, very simply. He was not doing a good job.
Donald Trump insists he fired James Comey for badly managing the investigation into Hillary Clinton's private email server. But Democrats say it was for his successful handling of another investigation, the FBI probe into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Just days before his dismissal, Comey had asked for more funding in the inquiry.
Were those investigations getting too close to home for the president? The dismissal of Director Comey establishes a very troubling pattern.
James Comey is the third high-profile law enforcement official to be fired by President Trump while involved in an investigation linked to his administration. Democrats renewed their calls for an independent investigation into alleged Russian ties, a demand that was preemptively dismissed by the Republican Senate Majority Leader.
Today we'll no doubt hear calls for a new investigation. Our Democratic colleagues complaining about the removal of an FBI director whom they themselves repeatedly and sharply criticized.
Democrats also questioned the role Attorney General Jeff Sessions played in Comey's dismissal. Sessions had to recuse himself from the investigations after failing to disclose his own contact with Russian officials during Trump's campaign. He'll now be one of the officials helping to choose the new director of the FBI.
Well, in the midst of all this, Trump received Russia's foreign minister at the White House in the highest level contact between the two countries since his inauguration. Laurent Berstecker has the story.
The Comey firing has a shadow of your talk, gentlemen.
Wasn't fired? You're kidding.
Brushing the question aside, Russia's top diplomat dismissed allegations of Russian interference in the Trump campaign as mere rumors, which he said were damaging the country's credibility.
I believe it is humiliating for the American people to even think that the Russian Federation is controlling the situation in America. How can it be possible for such a great power, such a great country?
Lavrov's visit to Washington came just a day after Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, who was leading a probe into alleged Russian meddling in the U.S. elections. The controversial decision sparked a storm of criticism from both Republicans and Democrats, with some saying the investigation was getting too close to home for Trump. Asked about the incident, Lavrov said the move was an internal affairs matter and had nothing to do with Russia. The U.S. president also dodged questions about Comey's dismissal, preferring instead to focus on the Syrian crisis, which he said he and Lavrov discussed at length during their meeting.
We had a very, very good meeting with Mr. Lavrov, and it was, I thought it was very, very good. What we want to do is we want to see the killing, the horrible killing in Syria stop as soon as possible, and everybody's working toward that end.
Both Trump and Lavrov also stressed the need to rebuild U.S.-Russian relations, which were heavily strained under Obama's 8-year presidency.
Well, the Russian president was also drawn into commenting on Trump's firing of the FBI director, on the side of a hockey pitch, no less. He humoured the journalist, but remained evasive.
There will be no effect. Your question looks very funny for me. Don't be angry with me. We have nothing to do with that. President Trump is acting in accordance with his competence and in accordance with his law and constitution. And what about us? Why we? You see, I'm going to play hockey with the hockey fans. And I invite you to do the same.
Donald Trump's controversial education secretary has been booed at a graduation ceremony in a historically black university. Betsy DeVos alienated the African-American community back in February when she called historically black universities pioneers of school choice. The reality is these universities were only established because black students were not allowed to go to higher education centres in many states. Well, students at the Bethune-Cookman said DeVos's policies disproportionately hurt minority students in the US.
Dr. Jackson, Board of Trustees, thank you so very, very much for this great honor and privilege. I am honored to become a Wildcat. And it's a real honor and privilege to be with you as we celebrate the Bethune-Cookman University class of 2017.
Well, as you can see there, the students turned their back on the education secretary. In the end, the university president took over the microphone in an attempt to restore calm. Staying in the Americas, Brazil's former president Lula da Silva has made an impassioned defence against the corruption charges he faces during 5 hours of testimony. Lula appeared before Judge Sergio Moro, who's made it his mission to eradicate corruption. Lula's accused of receiving a beach apartment as a bribe as part of a much wider corruption allegation scandal. He called the case a farce.
Never will I lie to people such as yourselves, because for a long time you have put your credibility and have seriously trusted me. I want to tell you something. I am alive, and I'm preparing to again be a presidential candidate of this country. I have never had such a strong will to be president as I do now.
Well, let's get the latest from our correspondent in Brazil, Tim Vickery. Tim, were we expecting to hear from Lula and to hear from him in this way?
Well, we didn't really know what to expect. We're moving into uncharted territory. And Lula's lawyers, they made a last-minute attempt to try and delay the proceedings by up to 90 days to study new accusations. And they also tried to disqualify Judge Sergio Moro on the grounds of a lack of impartiality. They were unsuccessful, and the hearing went ahead. It went ahead in an atmosphere that reflects Brazil's current polarised political climate. More than 50 busloads of Lula supporters were there, as were some of his opponents. There was a big security operation there in the courthouse. In the court itself, Lula spent more than 3 hours answering questions. He had no obligation at this stage to answer questions. The fact that the hearings went on for so long shows that he did answer the questions. His lawyers have dismissed the whole proceedings as a farce, an attack on democracy. We just heard Lula there reiterate his desire to be a presidential candidate next year. He said if he's lied, he'd rather be knocked down by a bus. And so far in this process, he certainly hasn't suffered a knockout blow.
Well, you touched on it there, but where does this leave Lula, both legally and also politically?
Well, so far, I think he's unlikely to have lost any political support, and he remains, in the opinion polls, the leading candidate for next year's presidential elections. If he's found guilty in the first and second instance of this case, he is disqualified from being a president, from being a candidate. But so far, it's hard to understand why the prosecution are spending so much time on these specific charges, which by the standards of Brazilian corruption are not huge. And also, there doesn't seem to be any real smoking gun, any real convincing proof. But this is only the first of 5 separate investigations which Lula is facing. So we'll have to see how this all unfolds in the long term.
Tim Vickery in Rio, thank you very much for that update. Well, inside Venezuela itself, another person has been killed during violent demonstrations that started 6 weeks ago, bringing the death toll to at least 38 people. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans protested in Caracas on Wednesday. They're calling on the president to resign, as Simon Harding reports.
Marching onto the Supreme Court from 6 different directions. Thousands of protesters once again inundated the streets. Very quickly, they crashed onto a wall of riot police, who pushed them back violently with tear gas and water cannons. The injured are evacuated, but the violence has reportedly caused other victims. Protesters are using their new weapon, bottles filled with excrement.
The police are using Molotov cocktails and rubber bullets. This is our only way of firing back.
Students, fishermen, farmers and council workers, all of them have gathered to oppose the new constitutional assembly.
The government is trying to impose an illegal constitutional assembly. What does that mean? Look at what they're doing to us with the help of the constitution that they created 18 years ago, the one we have now. Imagine what they would do with a new constitution that gave them even more power.
The protests against Maduro started on April 1st. They have often been violent and have claimed the lives of dozens of people. 70% of Venezuelans want Maduro to resign, despite him losing support on a daily basis. He attempted a counter-protest this Wednesday, filmed by the local media and broadcast 24 hours a day, a lot more than the opposition marches.
Families from across Mexico have gathered in the capital demanding justice for their missing children. Protesters joined the annual Mother's Day march, holding up portraits of their missing sons and daughters and calling for those responsible to face justice. Many of them come every year. Mexico's National Human Rights Commission says more than 30,000 people are missing, many of them in drug-related circumstances. In a few hours' time here in France, Emmanuel Macron's new party will be announcing the 577 candidates it's putting forward in parliamentary elections next month. Tens of thousands have applied to run on his ticket. Macron says at least half of those chosen will be from civil society rather than from government. The announcement of its candidates is at midday later today. It'll mark a change for the Republic on the move from political movement to political party. Well, meanwhile, far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon is hoping to capitalise on a historically high score in the presidential election. His party will be going it alone in next month's parliamentary elections. Mélenchon refused an alliance with the Communist Party, as Alison Sargent reports.
In France's second-largest city, Jean-Luc Mélenchon won the first round of voting. The leader of La France Insoumise is now hoping to become one of Marseille's representatives. He's running in a district that gave him over 39%, one of his highest scores. It's bad news for his opponent, an outgoing socialist.
Mr. Mélenchon has already been a candidate in the north, in Toulouse, in the southwest, in Paris and Seine-Saint-Denis. He comes here for the end of his career. Honestly, I think we should send him back home. What he wants is to destroy the French left. Well, the French left is here and is going to take him on.
The socialists aren't the only party facing competition from Mélenchon. The far-left leader has refused to form an alliance with the Communist Party.
7 million people voted for my program, A Shared Future. And I show up and tell them, wait, I'm going to sign an agreement with the Communist Party. Look, you voted for Mélenchon's shared future program, but now he's a communist. It's unthinkable.
According to Mélenchon's team, the communists alone are responsible for the rift. But their leader continues to call for the two groups to come to an agreement. Meanwhile, some 24 candidates originally from the Communist Party have already been registered under the banner of La France Insoumise, suggesting Mélenchon's determination to go it alone, establishing himself as the sole left-wing alternative to Emmanuel Macron.
It's 6:15 in the morning here in France. Let's give you an update of our headlines. The White House rejects calls by US Democrats for a special prosecutor to take over the investigation into Russia's alleged ties with the Trump campaign after the US president sacks the FBI director in charge. Brazil's former president makes a fiery defence against corruption charges against him in his first appearance before a judge who's promised to clean up the country's politics. And who'll be running under Emmanuel Macron's banner? We'll be showing you some of the candidates in next month's parliamentary elections, just hours before the president's new party announces them. Business now. Let's check in on the stock markets first. Let's have a look at how things closed on Wall Street. Wall Street seeing fairly muted trade on Wednesday, although the Nasdaq did manage to rise just enough to score another record close and a 5-day winning streak. The Dow Jones closing just under the flat line there. And let's take a look at the Asian markets now. Asian markets more or less rising, with energy firms providing strong support after a surge in oil prices. In Tunisia, the government is taking radical measures against social unrest. Protesters have been disrupting access to petrol, gas and phosphate sites, while President Essebsi is sending the army to secure production. Ellen Gainsford reports.
Protesters in rural Tunisia bring the street to a standstill. They're angry about poverty and high unemployment levels. Over the last few weeks, blockades in the gas-producing Tataouine area have disrupted access to production sites. President Kais Saied is taking unusual measures. The military will now step in to protect petrol, gas and phosphate sources.
The protesters have the right to protest in the correct way. I encourage all those who want to protest to be law-abiding, but on the condition you do not block production of the sole source of this country's revenue.
The unrest has already cost the phosphate industry over $2 billion. By sending the army, President Kais Saied hopes to reassure foreign investors, including Italian group Eni and Austrian OMV's gas production. The economy is faltering, with growth stuck around 1%, inflation near 5%, and joblessness at over 15%. 6 years since a revolution that toppled longtime dictator Ben Ali, Tunisia has yet to adequately tackle the issues of poverty, unemployment and corruption that sparked the uprising.
Well, moving on to some of the day's other business headlines now. Snapchat's parent company has published its first results since it began trading on the Nasdaq in March. The share price has dropped nearly a third since then, and Snap shares were trading down 3.5% at the closing bell. They've now plummeted 16% in overnight trade. Revenue was slightly weaker than expected at just under $150 million. Daily active user growth did rise, up 36% year on year, but perhaps not enough to reassure investors who are anxious to see whether the app can hold up against competition from Instagram and Facebook. Shareholders of Peugeot Citroën's parent company have given the green light to buy General Motors' European operations. The PSA Group announced in March it was offering €2.2 billion for the Opel and Vauxhall brands in a deal which will make it Europe's second biggest car maker. PSA chief Carlos Tavares told the meeting on Wednesday that he expected Opel to return to profit under its new ownership by 2020. The pharmaceutical firm Mylan has seen revenue jump 24% despite unveiling a cheaper, generic version of a popular allergy treatment. The American drug maker was the centre of controversy last year because of the skyrocketing price of its life-saving EpiPen. Sales of the original have declined because of new competition and Mylan's own authorised generic. Well, let's look ahead now to this week's episode of Revisited. And we're focusing on the world's youngest nation this week, formed in 2011. But the hope that accompanied South Sudan's formation was tempered by continued clashes in the north, which became full-blown civil war in 2013. The country remains racked by violence. It's rich in oil, but is one of the least developed countries in the world. Our team revisit South Sudan.
The security situation has degraded across South Sudan. The peaceful images splashed on UN posters throughout the capital are a far cry from the reality on the ground. Early hopes for national unity are now just memories. Independence Square, where they celebrated the birth of a new country in 2011, is abandoned. Just a few steps away, the renewed fighting of last summer began. The walls of the presidential palace are riddled with bullet holes. But it's outside of Juba where the scars of combat are most visible. Homes are destroyed by gunfire. Entire villages have been decimated. Since the beginning of the conflict 3 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. At least 3 million have been displaced by the war. Chul buys food at the small market inside the Juba camp, not daring to risk a trip into town. Since the July attack and without official justification, UN food rations have drastically decreased. Making ends meet is even tougher now, but Chul has no choice but to stay here under international protection.
It's through here that we enter and exit. I come here often. I sit here and look out, but I can't leave. It's even more difficult for men to leave the camps. They'll be killed. We women will only be beaten or raped. There are a couple of merchants that deliver food to the camp entrance, so some people take the risk of leaving the camp by a few meters to collect things and return with them to sell in the camp.
Rape is a daily occurrence in Juba. According to the UN, 70% of women in the city have been victims of sexual violence since the beginning of the conflict. Within the camp, each family has been deeply affected by the war, which began in 2013 as a political conflict. Soon after, armed groups began targeting civilians. Many massacres were carried out and often perpetrated along ethnic lines. Chul arrived here 3 years ago. She lives with her sister and 4 children in the same shelter. As part of the Nuer tribe, they were targeted early in the fighting. Her husband was assassinated. She fled immediately.
I saw mothers and their children killed together. When that happened, I took my kids and ran because I was told that all the people I live with would be killed in the same way.
For months, the family has faced a daily struggle to scrape together enough food. And these days, camp residents are coping with even greater challenges. The merchants that sell food to the displaced and the trucks that bring them water are regularly blocked by the military.
Because of the war, access to food has become very complicated. There's no access. Some people manage to find what they need, but others don't. We are reduced to begging from our relatives.
When food is available, the family gets 1 meal a day. Chul has been forced to find other ways to provide for herself and 5 dependents. In front of her shelter, she created a small tea room where the men in the camp can come for a break. But since the crisis in July, tea and sugar prices have risen dramatically.
I can buy a bag of sugar for £20. It used to cost 5. When the sugar was cheaper and the prices were lower, I had more customers. At the end of each day, my box would be full of bills.
But her work no longer suffices. The economic crisis in the camp has grown too severe. Prices across the country have also spiked due to the war. Products are imported from Uganda along the only paved road in the country, which runs from the border to Juba. In the past, boats traveled up the Nile towards Sudan. They all passed through Malakal, the second largest city in the country. But the war has made this navigation too dangerous. Today, the area is nearly inaccessible. Only UN aircraft can fly over the Nile to get here.
Well, there's still plenty more to come in the programme, including why children in Togo are at risk of torture and even of death from the very people they trust to protect them. Find out why later on in the programme.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
South Sudan, 2013. Civil war erupts 2 years after the country has reached independence. In an explosion of political and ethnic conflict, 3 million people abandoned everything overnight. Terrified of being massacred, the refugees are trapped in overcrowded UN camps and living in appalling conditions. Ethnic cleansing, impending famine, the youngest country in the world is heading for disaster.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
I'm Sarah Morris and I'm France 24's correspondent in Madrid. I'll bring you the latest news on Spain and Portugal, two countries battling to leave behind